Hey, Sun Devils. Welcome back to class lectures for AP European History. This is week 29. We're beginning our fourth quarter. This is the final week of notes on World War II. However, World War II still affects us today. It's been about 70 years since the biggest war in human history ended, and how it ended and the ramifications of that significant conflict still have a rippling effect on the world we live in today. The countries that have a permanent seat on the UN Security Council are the winners of World War II. The strongest economies, we can trace their roots back to World War II. It really is a catastrophically monumental event that happens in world history. If you haven't caught my other two lectures, week 28, we discussed World War II in Europe. And week 27, we kind of gave an overview of World War II. And the week before that, in week 26, we kind of talked about the rise of fascism and the rise of Imperial Japan. So this is just one of a several series, lectures on World War II. So thanks for being here. We're going to dive right into it and hopefully help you understand what it was like in Asia and the Pacific during World War II. If you want to dive deeper, I do have a recommendation. There's a podcast out there called Hardcore History by Dan Carlin, and he has a series on supernova of the East, and it's a multiple part series podcast on World War II. He has a great one on World War I that's called Blueprint for Armageddon. He's got a great one on World War II in Europe, Ghosts of the Ostfront. If you want to get into World War I and World War II, there's some great resources out there. So let's dive into it here, folks. Remember that there are two distinct theaters of the conflict. There's the European conflict that includes a giant chunk of Africa in that European theater, because really that's the first place Americans fought Nazis, right? Was when we landed Operation Torch, we landed troops and military supplies into North Africa to work with the British in expelling the Italian and German forces. By that point, even some of the French forces were working with the Nazis under the Vichy government. So there obviously was some serious ramifications on the continent of Africa with World War II. But this week, we're really just going to be focusing on the Asia theater. And Americans kind of refer to it as the Pacific War because really the war is going to be us moving cargo and troops across the Pacific trying to get to Japan. And ultimately, we're not really going to make it to Japan until the very end of the war. Troops don't actually set foot in the war until Japan surrenders. We do a lot of strategic bombings and carpet bombings and incinerating cities in Japan. But ultimately, we're working our way, hitting Strategic Island until we can get close enough to Japan to launch nonstop raids on Japan. So we don't want to get too ahead of ourselves, but let's dive into it. Again, remembering this visual map, I think geography is so important to learning history. You can't separate the two. You can't separate geography and history. If I talk about places, you have to be able to see it in your mind, okay? All right, so let's go ahead and dive into the Pacific theater of the war. The war in Asia started way before the war in Europe. Exactly at what point is it World War II is kind of difficult to determine. We have lots of dates out there. Some people would put it in 1931 when there was an incident that happened in Manchuria. Japan seized a giant chunk of China and renamed it Manchukuo, and it kind of became a puppet state. They put the last emperor of China in charge of Manchuria, but he answered to the Japanese, and everybody knew it was kind of a Japanese puppet state. So that goes all the way back to 1931. If you were living in Korea, you might say it was happening even earlier than that because Japan took over Korea way before 1930s. So exactly when does World War II start in Asia? Kind of depends on where you live, but most historians would put it in 1937 when Japanese forces invade mainland China and attack the capital at the time, Nanjing, as we've referred to that sometimes and controversially as the Rape of Nanking. But definitely when the Japanese invaded mainland China, that's what people see as the beginning of World War II. Remember, the United States doesn't get involved until the end of 1941. So there's a lot going on before the United States gets involved in the war in Asia. Japan was the most industrialized country in Asia. If you remember back a couple weeks ago, we talked about the Meiji Restoration. Remember that the Japanese saw what Europeans were doing through imperialism in Asia, and they didn't want to be taken over. So they thought it was better to industrialize and to start to do imperialism themselves rather than being taken over by somebody else. They also kind of followed a fascist ideology of seeing themselves as ethnically and racially superior to their fellow Asians. So some people will see the Japanese government as militaristic. It was. Some will see it as fascist. It was. It kind of followed that same mentality that a lot of Europeans were following, seeing themselves as a superior race, ethnically and racially. And so the Japanese were feeling the same thing. They thought that they were the masters of Asia. And they kind of had the proof of that because they weren't taken over by Europeans. They were taking over. I mean, they were following in suit to what Europeans were doing. And so that mentality and the ideology that was back during that time helped them to boast up propaganda and support of their ideas. They're going to be as ruthless as the Nazis. They're going to be sadistic and ruthless, and it gets pretty bad. Oftentimes we just peg, Nazis as the bad guys in World War II, but we forget about what was going on in Japan, and the fighting over in Asia is going to be intense. And unlike it is in Europe, it's going to be really intense. All right, so Japan was ruled by an emperor. Remember Hirohito? There is another guy named Tojo that people are going to kind of put as, really the guy in charge and leading the military. Hirohito was in a long line of emperors that ruled Japan. One interesting thing about Japanese emperors, they all come from the same family line. That's not true in most countries. There's dynasties, where different ruling families take over and oust the other one, and then supplant themselves as the leaders of a country. China's full of dynasties, from the Han and the Tang and the Song and the Ming and the Qing. I mean, there's lots of dynasties in China, but in Japan, it's almost like one consistent dynasty. And Hirohito, he doesn't leave office, or he doesn't leave his position as emperor after World War II. You think that, right? Hitler's going to die, and Mussolini's going to die, but Hirohito's going to stay in power. Tojo's going to take the brunt of all of this, but that was one of the conditions when the Japanese eventually do surrender. And Akihito, Hirohito's son, just relinquished the crown like a year ago or 2 years ago. It's really been in the last few years where Akihito, his son, has stepped down. And even Hirohito, the guy who's in charge of Japan during Pearl Harbor, he doesn't leave, he doesn't die and lose his throne until I was in grade school, even middle school. It was like 1989. So I think there's that overarching connection to Japanese culture that has to be talked about. Again, I just mentioned Hideki Tojo. The Japanese military really ran the show. Some people kind of see him as a modern day shogun, if that kind of harkens back to Japanese feudalistic ideas, where the shogun is the top military general and kind of runs the show, and the daimyo answer to him, and the samurai are those loyal soldiers. Now, feudalism was disbanded during the Meiji Restoration, but they still harken back to that romantic idea of Bushido and those ideologies. So some people do see Tojo as a sort of quasi shogun in the modern sense. Okay. But when we look at Japan during the time, it's definitely fascist and it's definitely militaristic. Those are true ways to look for it. Some people, and I think rightly so, see Japan's invasion of China and Japan's extension of territory in Asia during and before the World War II era, see it as really a fight for land, natural resources, food, and to obtain political power in Asia. Those are the three real things that Japan was looking for. Japan is a set of islands, and as it was expanding industrially, there's a limited amount of land, and it's pretty mountainous and rugged in Japan. So their population really was pushing the boundaries. And to extend into Korea made sense to the Japanese. It was horrific for the Koreans, but made sense to the Japanese because they saw Europeans already doing these type of things. And they were just following suit. That's what international major countries who want to be a player in the world, that's what they do. You know, right or wrong, that's what everybody else was doing, so they were going to do it too. And don't forget, the United States is not innocent in this. The United States had seized the Philippines. The United States has sent military troops into Beijing or Peking during the Boxer Rebellion at the end of the 1800s. So we were gobbling up islands in the Pacific at the same time the Japanese were. And some of the things we did there were not very nice either. Talk to the Queen of Hawaii, right? The Sandwich Islands. Or how the people of Samoa felt when we divided up the Samoan Islands with the Germans, you know? So the United States is not innocent in this as well. In some ways, we were doing the same thing the Japanese were doing. Again, if people saw a Nazi flag, they would automatically tag it in their head as boom, evil, right? When people see the imperial flag of Japan, they don't get the same sensibility, but they probably should, because it was a sign of terror, and the Japanese were ruthless. Sometimes the Asians, when the Japanese moved into a country that had previously been controlled by Europeans, at first a lot of the Asians are like, oh, thank you. Finally, the Asians, looking out for other Asians and kicking the Europeans out. Unfortunately, the Japanese were probably worse and more cruel than the Europeans when they moved in, and so that idea was quickly debunked. The Japanese were not seen as heroes and liberators for the most part. So let's talk about a little. I'm kind of a linear teacher. I like to say, here's step one, here's step two, here's step three. Obviously, there's other things to consider. I'm not aware of the. I'm not. I don't like to overwhelm students with information. That's why I simplify it. But I'm not ignorant of the fact that it's not this simplistic. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. But here is step number one. When we see the Japanese conquering Asia, step number one, we really look at Korea. This goes back to maybe even before the 20th century. We're talking maybe even late 1800s. Japan is really starting to have a huge influence there. And they do have some conflict with China and Russia over access to mainland Asia. Remember the Sino-Japanese War, and then, of course, the famous Russo-Japanese War. Those all happened before Japan officially takes Korea. So some people might say, well, what about Taiwan? Oh, well, I get that. Again, there's always more complexity to it. But when Japan really starts to really become an imperial power and seize territory, I would put it at least by 1910. That's pre-World War I, but they're taking over Korea. There was no North and South at the time. It was just the Korean Peninsula. Again, we talked about this. The Japanese invade a chunk of China, and I'll show you on a map in a minute. It's the northern section of China, right next to Mongolia, right next to the Korean Peninsula, and strategically important for a lot of countries like Russia and of course, China, which claims that territory. It was the Manchurians who were the leaders of the last dynasty in China, the Qing. But the Japanese invade. There's a little explosion on a railway that happens, the Manchurian incident, and the Japanese may have been involved in causing this terrorist attack to happen and then claiming somebody else did it so that they had a reason to come in. But whatever happened, the Japanese take over Manchuria, renaming it Manchukuo. Okay, that's step number two. They actually seize a part of China. Now, this is the start of World War II in Asia. The Japanese invade mainland Asia. The numbers are all over the place. Of course, the Japanese say it's way less than 300,000. The Chinese probably put the figures way over 300,000. You could Google it and find probably, I'm exaggerating maybe, but 300,000 different numbers for how many people were killed in the rape of Nanjing or Nanking. But nonetheless, this is really what gets international attention. Even the United States tries to put economic pressure on Japan to back down. We're not happy with what's going on. And that's when we start cutting off oil supplies to Japan. So I think that that's really important to note. Okay, now after the Japanese invade China, they start to work on other parts of Asia and slowly start to take over Southeast Asia, pieces of European empires. This is really when Japan invades European colonies. So the British are going to lose Singapore and Hong Kong, and the French are going to end up losing Indochina, right? French Indochina. That's Laos and Cambodia and Vietnam. So the British and the French are going to start to lose territories, and even Dutch territories are going to be invaded, like Indonesia. And it even looks like the Japanese might invade Australia. That was a serious consideration and a fear for the Allied powers. And of course, in the midst of all of that is a U.S. territory of the Philippines. So again, you can see why geography is so important if you're going to talk about any historical event. Okay. The United States doesn't get involved until December 7th, 1941. That's the infamous attack on Hawaii. Some students don't know that simultaneously or within like 12 hours, the military bases in the Philippines were attacked. In 12 hours, that's almost simultaneously, especially in the 1940s. So the U.S. military bases in the Philippines are also attacked. And that's when the United States gets involved. And we talked about this before. Why did Japan attack the United States? Was it unprovoked? Well, we were putting political pressure on them, economic pressure on them, because of what we saw them doing in mainland Asia. So we were kind of poking the bear, and we felt justified in doing that because what the Japanese were doing was horrific. So maybe we should have poked the bear. And maybe we were looking for a reason, to get involved. But nonetheless, the Japanese did attack. But if you're a Japanese person, you might say less than 100 years ago, Matthew Perry and U.S. warships showed up in Tokyo Bay with our guns, forcing Japan to open up trade, kind of getting them to either be taken over or join the industrial powers of the world. So there's always lots of domino pieces. If you look at one event like Pearl Harbor, please don't be ignorant of everything that happened before. That's the process of history. Look at these dates right here. You can see like the Japanese took over Taiwan or Formosa, right? The island of Formosa, way back in the end of the 1800s in the Sino-Japanese War. You can see that they were gobbling up islands in the Pacific during the late 1800s when the US and Europeans weren't getting involved in imperialism, right? So you can see there's pieces of the puzzle. I started with Korea, step number one. Step number two is Manchukuo or Manchuria. It's the whole northern chunk of China. And then, of course, eventually the Japanese attack mainland China. You can see that they take over giant chunks. They do come into conflict with the British in Hong Kong. And you can see they're going to end up taking over all of French Indochina. And there's going to be fighting all down in Southeast Asia. The British do have like a home court advantage to a certain extent in India. They're going to use Indian troops and Indian resources, even though the Indians wanted to be independent. India is going to get its independence from the British after World War II. And there's going to be a whole bunch of old European colonies that are going to get their independence after World War II. This map right here, of course, shows the extent of Japan's military aggression in the Pacific. This is kind of like their wall, their defensive wall, if you will. They did attack beyond it, of course, Pearl Harbor and Midway, but this becomes like the extent of their real control. As you can see, they go down into Indonesia, not quite to Australia because they're defeated at the Battle of Coral Sea. But you can see that they took over most of Southeast Asia, which was British and French and Dutch areas, right? And of course, the United States territories. So, again, look at this map right here and familiarize yourself with it. We'll come back to this, but hopefully you can see it visually when we talk about different places. These are British soldiers being taken prisoner by the Japanese. Some Americans did volunteer to fight before the U.S. officially entered the war. Over in Europe, they called it the Eagle Squadron. And those were Americans who joined the RAF, the Royal Air Force, over in Europe to fight the Nazis. But there was also some Americans who joined the Flying Tigers in Asia and got involved, because they felt a moral obligation to stop the Japanese from doing what they were doing. Okay. Sometimes when we talk about the Pacific Island, people picture these tropical paradise. But some of it was intense jungle fighting with scary, poisonous spiders and snakes, and the humidity is just out of control. I spent a couple weeks in Hong Kong during the summer, and I thought I was going to freaking die because of the humidity. It's out of control. But there's places in the Pacific that are beautiful, but they're also really thick with humidity, and so there's some intense jungle fighting, and you don't know where the enemy is. Kind of what we envision with like Vietnam, if you will. If you're an American, we think of jungle fighting in Vietnam, but the Allied troops were doing this during World War II as well. Now, there's this famous saying, whether it happened or not, that after the Japanese attacked the United States at Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. It's supposedly one of the captains or generals, like Yamamoto, was supposedly supposed to say, "Hey, I think we just woke a sleeping giant. We may have, terrorized them at Pearl Harbor, and we may have won that easily, but I think we just poked the bear, so to speak." This is the Japanese saying this about the Americans. We've just woken a sleeping giant, and it's true. Before Pearl Harbor, the U.S. did not agree with Japanese aggression in China, and we had cut off oil supplies to Japan, right, with embargoes and sanctions. And the Japanese military leaders came to the conclusion that they needed to eliminate any U.S. presence in the Pacific, especially the Philippines. That was right in the middle of what the Japanese were doing. So even though they hit us at Pearl Harbor to destroy our Navy, they were really more strategically interested in the Philippines, right? And of course, I've mentioned this multiple times. December 7th, 1941. Interesting, it's a Sunday. The Japanese did this on purpose because, probably like you and me, most Americans on Sunday are sleeping in, or they're going to church, or they're going golfing. They're not working, right? It's like the down day. And the Japanese knew that, and they attacked Pearl Harbor. Remember, it wasn't a state in 1941. It was a territory, just like the Philippines. The Japanese also attacked military bases in the Philippines hours after Pearl Harbor, leading to the Bataan Death March. Maybe as many as 76,000 prisoners were taken. That's Filipinos and Americans. Remember, the Philippines were as much a part of the United States as Hawaii was, territories. Okay? So what happened in the Philippines? It's pretty big. It's a lot bigger, a lot more deaths in the Philippines than in Pearl Harbor, but Pearl Harbor happened in one day. So boom, it's like a huge strike, After the attack on Pearl Harbor and the Philippines, the U.S. really wanted to get back at the Japanese, and so we had a secret military operation called the Doolittle Raid, where we actually struck at the heart of Japan. I'm going to rewind this just for a second. So after Pearl Harbor, a couple months after Pearl Harbor, the U.S. sent some of its aircraft carriers deep into Japanese territory. We got as close as we could to Japan without risking our aircraft carriers, and we launched bombers off of an aircraft carrier, which had never been done before. If you want to watch the movie Pearl Harbor, you get to see this at the end. They launched the Doolittle Raid, and they hit targets in Japan and then tried to crash land in China, hopefully in Chinese-controlled territory, because they're fighting the Japanese. So if we made it, to non-Japanese controlled parts of China, right? Anyways, because there's no way they could land those big bombers back on an aircraft carrier. And as soon as they launched, they returned back to safer waters. Anyways, it turns out that battleships are not as significant of players in naval conflicts. It turns out what really matters is aircraft carriers. And whoever has the most aircraft carriers wins. And thankfully, our aircraft carriers were not at Pearl Harbor, or it would have been a whole different situation. Okay, so hopefully we're on track, all on the same page here. Okay. Now, this is the opposite map of what we just looked at. The last map shows the Japanese expanding. This is going to show the United States and how we strategically tried to get close enough to Japan to actually cause them to surrender. So you're going to hear places when you study about World War II in the Pacific, you're going to hear about Tarawa. Maybe you've never heard of Tarawa, but catastrophic fighting in Tarawa. Places like Peleliu, more famous places like Saipan or Guam, which is still a U.S. territory today. Iwo Jima and Okinawa are probably the most intense, as we got super close to the actual Japanese islands. There are tons of naval battles as well. We do end up landing, MacArthur swears he's going to return to the Philippines when he's kicked out. Actually, he's not kicked out. He's going to stay there and die, but the U.S. president requires him to leave, and he's pretty pissed off about that. He doesn't like leaving the Philippines, but he swears he's going to return. And you do get some help from, the British pulling some pressure in and bringing some, Allied air supply routes to China. There was something called the Burmese Road, right, where we were bringing supplies into Chinese allies and British, and sometimes American pilots pulling bombing raids on Japanese targets. And of course, I'm giving away the ending, but the only two atomic bombs that are ever used are going to be actual bombs dropped on Hiroshima and then Nagasaki. But there are actual less deaths in those two atomic bombs than the incendiary bombs, the inferno bombs that we drop on Tokyo. We torch Tokyo. Tokyo is one of the most modern cities in the world because nothing of old Tokyo is left. Catastrophic. Anyways, a little old school drawing. Some people ask, why were all the ships lined up so tightly in Pearl Harbor on the island of Oahu next to Honolulu? And the truth is, the Navy was more concerned about sabotage. If you have ships spread out all over and some Japanese come in and, torch a ship, and cause damage or destroy fuel lines, those kind of things. They weren't necessarily worried about a full-on attack. And so that's why they lined all the battleships up in nice tight rows so they could keep a watch on them. And that makes it easy targets for Pearl Harbor. And of course, maybe you've been to Hawaii. I took my daughters out to the island of Oahu a couple of years ago, and we went on a little tour of Pearl Harbor. And the USS Arizona is still there in Pearl Harbor, and all the soldiers that died on it are still in the ship. They purposely left them there as kind of like a monument and grave. And there was a couple guys who actually got off the Arizona before it sank, and when they died, they asked for their bodies to be put into the Arizona. Seriously, to have their bodies returned. So there's still oil and gook leaking from the Arizona. If you go out to Pearl Harbor, it's an amazing tour. Highly recommend it. This is really an amazingly stunning picture. In my classroom, this guy right here, I have a signed poster from him. He was there at Pearl Harbor. He had an unfortunate name for living during World War II times. His name is Adolf. Not all Adolfs are bad, right? We always think Adolf Hitler, right? But this guy's name is actually Adolf. He's an American guy, and I've got a signed poster of him. And I've heard him tell stories about being there at Pearl Harbor. And that's the thing about World War II. We still have people who experienced it. Both of my grandparents served in World War II. This is some pictures of the Bataan Death March. And again, when you go Google the number of people that died on the Bataan Death March, you'll get really different numbers, but thousands of soldiers were killed, died as prisoners of war under Japanese occupation of the Philippines. Okay, so U.S. strategy in the Pacific. Most of the battles in the U.S. That the U.S. fights in are in the Pacific, right? We don't actually do a lot of fighting on the mainland of Asia. A little bit, but not really. It's mostly naval battles or landing on strategic islands. So naval and air battles over the ocean. That's why Americans think of this as the Pacific. Okay? The U.S. develops a system of island hopping that is hitting strategic islands and setting up air bases to get supplies and manpower across the Pacific. Ultimately, of course, with the idea of bombing the actual mainland of Japan, the islands, the main islands of Japan. Okay. As we got closer and closer to Japan, the number of civilian suicides went up. The Japanese just don't have the concept of surrender. Even if they're outgunned and outmanned, they're not going to surrender. And there's a couple of stories of these civilians who were told by Japanese propaganda and Japanese radio information that if the Americans captured them, they would eat them. So it was really interesting how scary it was for the Japanese civilians. They thought that the Americans were going to rape their women, eat their children, kill them all. And so they would rather die than be taken prisoner. So there's stories of mass civilian suicides. It's tough to talk about all of the battles, but here's a couple of the really significant ones you're going to want to write down. The Battle of the Coral Sea is the U.S. and British Navy saving Australia from Japanese invasion. We kind of stopped the Japanese from getting below the Indonesian islands. And so a lot of people see that as strategic because then the United States can kind of use Australia as a base of operations, to fight the Japanese. The Battle of Midway is maybe the turning point in the Pacific theater. It's not the end of the war, not even close, but it's the last time the Japanese really go on the offensive. When they lose the Battle of Midway, they go on the defensive. And the Battle of Midway is like the end of the Hawaiian Islands, like way out the end. There's a chain of old islands called Midway, right in the middle of the Pacific. And actually, the Americans get the surprise on the Japanese. And so that's one of the things that really helps us kind of turn the tide. Guadalcanal is like one of the first time where Americans are on an island actually fighting the Japanese. And there's horrific stories, sometimes the ships would drop the Marines off and then try to get out of there as quick as possible so they don't get sunk by the Japanese air power. And so then the Marines are kind of stranded on this island trying to do their best job of seizing control of the island. And Guadalcanal it's a bloodbath and it's horrific. There's some starvation and there's some awful stories. Again, as I said, the Japanese just don't really have a concept of surrender. And so U.S. troops encountered these banzai charges where the Japanese might have run out of ammunition, but that doesn't mean they surrender. That means they pick up swords and knives or bamboo poles and charge machine guns. There's no such thing as surrender. One of the other problems is if the U.S. injures a Japanese soldier, the idea of civilized war is even if it's your enemy, you still give them medical care. But sometimes these Japanese, they would be injured, and when the U.S. troops would come over to check out the bodies and see if everybody's dead, or maybe even offer medical assistance, the Japanese soldier might have a hand grenade and pull the pin and blow himself up with these U.S. soldiers. And so the U.S. soldiers started like getting really cruel back. Is kind of that whole tit for tat kind of an idea, like, hey, if they're going to play this way, we're going to get dirty too. And there's some horrific stories. You want to hear some horrific stories? Check out that podcast on hardcore history, the supernova of the East, and you will be blown away with some of the stories. Anyways, there's also the whole suicide kamikaze. Sometimes that you as a Japanese soldier, you'd have your funeral before you left. Right? I know that sounds sick and wrong, but some of the Japanese mothers would give a gun to their kid and say, hey, don't come back. Either kill as many Americans as you can or to defend Japan and your honor and your family name. And if you're going to be taken prisoner, it's better you take out as many of them as you can, So it gets pretty intense. The closer to Japan, more soldiers die taking heavily fortified islands, especially Iwo Jima and Okinawa. a little clip. It's a trailer really from the movie Midway, but a great movie that kind of shows you what it might have been like to be a U.S. naval pilot, attacking the Japanese aircraft carriers at Midway. This is probably the most famous picture, and it's been turned into statues. And iconically, it's of Iwo Jima, the Marines hoisting an American flag at the top of a hill in Iwo Jima. I got some video clips I pulled from different movies and film clips about what it might have been like to fight in Iwo Jima or Okinawa, these islands, as the U.S. was doing its island hopping campaign. Japanese kamikazes, right? Imagine you see a plane coming at you, and instead of it shooting a torpedo and flying away, the whole plane just comes at you and boom, hits your deck and sinks the entire ship. One Japanese life for 1,000 Americans. I mean, if you are brainwashed into thinking that's honorable and that's it's effective, it's scary, right? The way that the war was fought in the Pacific against the Japanese, it really is different than it is in Europe, than fighting in New Guinea, right? So here's something interesting. The U.S. military, any military, needs to send its information coded. The Germans were famous for using their Enigma machine, right? And the Allies were trying to crack the Enigma the entire time. That's a coded machine that the Nazis used. The U.S. got pretty good at reading Japanese military information, even though they coded it. But the U.S. didn't want the same thing to happen for them. And so what they started to do is use Navajo Indians. Because Navajo is it's like a non-written language, and who speaks Navajo? Nobody but people who are from the Navajo Nation in the the Southwest United States. You know, that whole Four Corners area. Where Utah and Arizona and New Mexico and Colorado come together, right? Where the Navajo Nation is. And so these Navajo had grown up in the United States, so they spoke English, but they also spoke their old Navajo language. And it's a unique language in the world. It's not unlike anything else. And so if you put a Navajo guy on one radio and another Navajo guy on the other Navajo, and then they talk in code, it's like unbreakable. And so the United States is kind of famous for using Navajo code talkers. The U.S., the United States government didn't know what to think about Japanese who were born in the United States. There's a lot of people who had immigrated from Japan before the war and who were Americans. But on the West Coast, the United States decided to do something ugly. It's not something we're proud of, but we took Japanese, we rounded them up, and put them into intern camps. Now, these are not horrific death camps like the Holocaust. These are not, they're not death camps. But these Japanese did lose their jobs, were pulled out of their home, and especially in Central California, you can still find some museums that will show, how it affected Japanese Americans. Interesting, right? Because we're at war with the Japanese, we automatically start thinking all Japanese are the enemy. And it's not true. A lot of the Japanese were loyal Americans, you know? Like for instance, if I have German heritage, that doesn't mean I was loyal to Germany. It doesn't mean my family was loyal to the Nazis, right? So, but it's kind of hard to tell which white people are from German or British background. I mean, it's not as obvious as like Japanese background. And so the Japanese definitely felt targeted and picked on. One of the interesting things that happens near the end of the war is the U.S. president, FDR, the longest serving U.S. president. Remember, he serves 4 terms. Well, he gets voted in 4 times, dies early in his 4th term. But President Franklin Delano Roosevelt dies in 1945, and Harry Truman, the vice president, takes over near the end of the war. And he's the guy who imagine coming into office and you don't even know what's going on. I mean, you're the vice president, but you don't have all the information the president has. And then to find out there's been a secret project going on that nobody else knows about. Very top secret. It's called the Manhattan Project. And it had been a secret operation kind of headed by Oppenheimer, right? Using some of the theoretical physics ideas of Einstein was one of the most genius guys in the world, but he was a pacifist. He didn't want to get involved in the Manhattan Project. Still, people attributed some of that ingenuity to him, and he didn't like that. But the U.S. decides to use its new A bomb, its atomic bomb. They kind of figured we'd save more lives. We're going to kill a lot of Japanese, but we're going to end up saving American lives in the end. And so Truman has to make that call. And he believes that he's going to save American lives at the expense of Japanese lives. And all the information coming out of Japan, I mean, all the propaganda, the emperor was saying, we'll never surrender. That's what the emperor of Japan was saying. And he said, every man, woman, and child is going to fight. If the Americans want to set foot on Japan, they're going to have to fight every single one of us. And the casualty rates kept getting more and more the closer we actually got to Japan. And so a lot of Americans are saying this is true. That's it's not an exaggeration. So the Enola Gay is the actual plane that flew the first atomic bomb. The first two atomic bombs were called Little Boy and Fat Man. And of course, the first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, and the second one was dropped on Nagasaki. And then shortly thereafter, the Japanese surrendered. No single war or event has had such a huge effect on our nation and the world as World War II did, right? More people died, more raw material was wasted, and more horrors committed in World War II than any other event in history. But was the United States justified in using the atomic bomb? I think this is a really interesting political cartoon because when I look at like what the terrorists did on 9/11, when these guys flew planes into the World Trade Centers and the Pentagon, most estimates put the number of deaths on 9/11 at under 3,000. That's a lot. But the number of people that the United States killed when we dropped bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they top 80 or 90,000. Was it justified? There's both sides. I think that's the beautiful part of a social science class, where there's not always a right answer, where we get to debate and discuss, and we look at different evidence, and we try to take cultural ideas, and we try to take the mood and the attitude at the time. Because here we are in the year 2020, I'm recording this, and I'm judging those people. But who knows? Maybe it really did save tons of American lives. And if we have the weapon, and it will end the war, and it did end the war, maybe a quick knockout is better than a long, dragged out. And how could you look at a mother in her face and say, "Hey, we had a weapon that could have ended the war, but instead we chose to send your son to invade the Japanese homeland, the islands of Japan, instead of using the weapon we had"? Did the Japanese start this fight? Were we just ending it? That's what I love about the social sciences. Looking at the human story, and there's no story quite like the devastation and some of the stories that come out and the atrocities that happened that the Japanese committed, but then that was committed on them. It's just staggering. This is some of the Japanese Americans being pulled into intern camps in the U.S. You can see on the map where some of them were located. And I got some little videos in here that covers Japanese internment camps. Incendiary bombs dropped on Japanese cities killed more than the atomic bombs did in World War II. We lit up Tokyo. We carpet bombed him, purposely having bombs that caused firestorms. It's sickening, but it's also interesting, and it's catastrophic. These are just some visuals of, like, say, the Burma Road. That was the British trying to supply the Chinese, right? Cut into the rugged landscape and carved out of the forests. There's so many stories. I think I said this before, but the more you learn about something like World War II, the more you realize you don't know. I mean, there's so much to learn. Even if you studied it for years and years, you'll never come to the end of learning stuff about World War II and the personal stories, and getting a visual of what it was like. If we're in class, I show little clips and try to get people emotionally involved, helping them see what was going on, what it would have been like. We talk about like the D-Day invasion of Normandy, right, to save Europe. you know, June 6th, 1944. But how many different amphibious invasions did we do in the Pacific? Right? I mean, D-Day was like a once invasion. And there was other ones. We landed amphibious landings in Italy and in North Africa. But the number of times we did it in the Pacific was staggering, you know? And there's so much documentation. So much documentation. There's great videos on YouTube or other platforms as well, from Netflix to Amazon Prime, to kind of get it. To kind of bring this to a close, one of the things that's really important is at the end of World War II, the leaders have to decide what the world's going to look like. Right? So the first time that the Allies kind of got together, well, at least the US and the UK, before the US even got involved in the war, Churchill spent time coming to the States. Actually, Churchill's his mom was from the United States, so Churchill kind of was part American, to be honest. But before the United States even joined, the United States and the United Kingdom were already kind of drafting up ways to help Stalin and the Soviet Union to fight against the Nazis. We call it the Atlantic Charter. It's the first, like, hey, we're probably going to be joining you. And even if we don't officially join you, we're going to be supplying you. So even before Pearl Harbor, the U.S. was already leaning towards the Allied team. One of the first times that we really get to plans to invade Europe happened at Casablanca. Casablanca is a city in Morocco in North Africa. And the US and the UK, again, are agreeing, hey, the best place to attack Europe is not in France, and it's not actually in Germany. The best place is going to be the soft underbelly, right? So attacking Italy. So once we get North Africa under control, boom, we can move into Italy. Again, in Asia, this is where the three big leaders meet: Churchill, Stalin, and of course Roosevelt. And they meet in a neutral country, Persia, right, or Iran today, in Tehran. And that's where they, Stalin says, hey, we're breaking the back of the Nazis. We're doing all the work, and you guys are sitting around taking all the glory. You got to do your part. You got to invade. And you got to invade not just Italy, you got to invade German-occupied France. And so that's when they plan D-Day. They meet at Yalta near the end and kind of solidify their plans of, what's the world going to look like when the war's done. And Yalta, of course, is like a coastal town in Soviet-occupied area. And then Potsdam is really the final meeting, as we've kind of solidified the war in Europe. And in Potsdam, the U.S. says, hey, you got to help us take on Japan. And the Soviets agree. After Germany surrenders, the Soviets agree that they're going to help, fight the Japanese. But it's going to end pretty quick with the atomic bomb. And some people say that the atomic bomb was used because Stalin was starting to act like Hitler. He already was like Hitler, but he started to show it a little bit more. And some of the Allies were nervous that if the Allies didn't show that they had superior firepower, that maybe Stalin would have kept rolling his tanks across all of Europe, because all of Europe was vulnerable at the time. And the United States kind of felt like if we show off our superior weapons and end the war, then Stalin will realize, whoa, I don't want to mess with that. So that's another reason why the United States might have used the atomic bomb. This is a picture of MacArthur returning to the Philippines. Remember the Navajo code talkers. Some great information here on using the Navajo Indians, which is interesting because we kind of took their land. Not kind of, we did as a country. We took their land and overran them, and I guess we gave them reservations, but that's not very nice of us. Anyways, but for the Navajo to step up and help is amazing. And here's the official Japanese surrender, right? And of course, maybe the most famous picture ever at the end of World War II, the celebration around the world. Now, this is not the only lecture on World War II. There are at least two other ones, plus some other ones that kind of give background and information. So I didn't cover everything in this lecture. And even I didn't cover everything in Asia. There's so much to learn. That's why I give assignments like watching some review videos, in class, or showing videos when we're in class on World War II. But thanks for being with me. This is week 29. When we come back for week 30, we're going to cover the Cold War, and that is, well, the preparation and planning for World War III that never quite heats up. Thanks again, Sun Devils. We'll talk to you soon.